I'll be reading from Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 2 of the NIV. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and the perfecter of faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The church said, Amen.
There's a story about a lion who decided to walk around the jungle one day just to remind everyone who was king of the jungle. So as the lion was prowling about, he saw a little mouse, and he moved closer to the mouse, and he growled at it and said, "Who's king of the jungle?" And of course, the mouse was terrified for his life and said, well, you are, Mr. Lion. And he said, "That's right, don't you forget it." And then the lion went a little further, and he found a monkey swinging in a tree, and he kind of put his paws up in the tree and said, "Who's the king of the jungle?" And the monkey said, well, you are, Mr. Lion. And he said, "That's right, don't you forget it." And then as the lion went about, he came across an elephant. And so the lion went up to the elephant and said, "Who's king of the jungle?" And the elephant just ignored him. And so he got a little closer and said it a little bit louder, "Who is king of the jungle?" And the elephant took his trunk, he grabbed the lion by the neck, and he slammed him on the ground, and he slammed him on the ground, and he threw him up against a tree. And so the lion kind of got up, and he was bloodied, and he kind of limped back over to the elephant, and he said, "Look, just because you don't know the answer to the question, it doesn't mean you have to get all mad about it." We've been doing a study about humility. We're calling it God is Greater, that God is greater than our ups and downs, and we live our best life when we learn to put God in the place that he belongs, on the throne of our life. I want to walk us through some of the different topics we've been talking about, because these do move in kind of a sequence. To begin with, we've talked about the importance of allowing God to be God, that he's God, we're not. I can't do the things that he can do. I have to trust him to play that role in my life that only he can. As a part of that, we also have to learn to trust God's will even more than we trust our own will. That I have ideas about what I want, but if my ideas are in conflict with God's ideas, I need to trust God's will more than I trust my own. Now, inevitably, as we do this, life is going to get hard. And so when life gets hard, it's important that we don't give up, that we persevere. And even in difficult times, we trust that God could use things that were hard for us for our good later on. In that process, inevitably, we're going to mess up. So the fourth thing that we talked about is how there is healing found in confession and prayer, that when something has gone awry and I've maybe developed a bad habit within myself, bad tendencies within myself, when we confess those and we open up about those, it liberates us from them, and God helps us to move past them. We also talked about how really we all do have what we need. We don't need to be so materialistic or so driven just to have things, that with God's love and God's grace, we have what we need. Last week, we talked about purifying our speech, that once we're really centered in God and we're trusting God and living in obedience to his will and trying to get those negative things out of our life, we do need to purify the way that we talk. What I wanted to talk to us about today is the importance of striving only for God's approval. That of all the people that I could try to please, God is the one, first and foremost, that I'm worried about pleasing in my life with my actions and the things that I do. As long ago as the Tower of Babel, people have struggled with this urge to be famous and to be number one. And I could probably trace it back to the garden as well. But I think in Genesis 11, this story is fairly captivating if you read their motives for why it was they wanted to build this tower. Now, it seems that what they're trying to do is to build some kind of a building. I think we would probably call them today a ziggurat, but something that would be really, really tall, like a skyscraper, something that appeared to reach the heavens. And if you read their reasoning for why they wanted to do this, God had told them to be faithful to him and then be fruitful and multiply and spread his love throughout the earth. And they said, let's not spread out. Let's all stay right here together, work together, and make a name for ourselves. Their goal in building that tower was to become famous. They wanted to be known for what it was they could do. Let's make a name for ourselves. We all struggle with that desire that we want people to know who finished first, or who's king of the jungle, or who can have the biggest or the best. And so I've titled my lesson for this morning, Embracing Anonymity. Learning to embrace the importance of often being anonymous. And I don't mean that in terms of whether or not God knows us. Certainly I believe that God knows each of us individually. But in regard to the world, can we as people get comfortable with pleasing God and not caring if anyone else knows about us or not? Can we learn to embrace being anonymous? And I have to tell you, even if you don't want to do this, if you'll just reflect a little bit on the nature of the world, you'll realize this is an important thing to learn to live with and to accept. Think about 5 generations back in your family. What do you know about the people who were living 5 generations back? Say 150 years ago that you're related to. Some of you might know a little bit. You might know their names. For example, I've got one relative, Grandpa McIntyre, my great-great-great-grandfather. The only thing I know about him is that he was a doctor. We still have like his little medical bag. We have his certificate from his medical school. And we even have a few receipts where he would deliver a baby for a bag of flour and a chicken or something like that. But, very different world that he lived in. But I would say what I know about him is probably more than the average person knows about their great-great-great-grandparents. But could you tell me, and I couldn't tell you about him, what was his personality actually like? What did it sound like when he laughed? What were his mannerisms? What were his hobbies and his interests? What were his goals for his life? What were the things that he was afraid of? Because truthfully, when you think just a few generations back, we don't really know any of those things, do we? Do you know those things about your great-great-great-grandparents? See, it doesn't take very long at all until we kind of move on from the present conscience of the people who are living, and we start disappearing from the memory of the world. We become part only of God's memory. We have to find contentment in the relationships that we have with each other now, because these are the relationships that are going to matter for us in what we've done into eternity. But ultimately, it's God's memory that matters the most. And if you think of all the things people would do to try and sustain their memory for the next 5 generations, what could you possibly do that people would remember you for 150 years from now? And other than be president and like a list of presidents, there's really not that much, is there? There's not much we could do that we could establish ourselves for that long. And truthfully, 150 years from now, I would imagine if people then are the way that people are now, they're probably all just going to be worried about making themselves famous. I mean, how much time do we spend worrying about the fame of our great-great-great-grandparents? No, we're worried about ourselves. And I think people 150 years from now will probably be the same way. So perhaps a helpful question for us to sort out what's actually worth doing in our life would be this question about applause. In my life, in the choices that I'm making, whose applause is it that I'm trying to earn? Whose applause is it that I'm trying to win? Am I trying to get people to approve of me, or am I trying to get God to approve of me? And in many cases, the actions we take might even be the same. It's the question of why that becomes more important. So you might work really hard and be successful in your career, but it makes a difference if you're doing that purely because you want people to know you're successful, or because you want to feel successful, or if you're doing that because you believe that you should do everything as if you're serving the Lord. And so you work hard and you achieve because you're doing that for God. Motive matters in the things that we do. Whose applause is it that we're trying to win? Who is it that we're trying to get to remember us? Is it just the people who've heard of us, or is it God's memory of us that we're wanting to matter? Because in the end, on the day of judgment, what is it that's going to matter for you other than God's memory of your life and whether you lived for Him or you didn't? What else could you put in place of that as something more important? God's memory of you, the way that God would evaluate the way that you've lived. Because you can fool people. We can put on masks, we can fool people, but you can't fool God. God knows what's going on the inside. He knows your heart, whether you're succeeding or you're failing. He knows what it is you're intending to do and trying to do. And it's His applause that matters the most. I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but I've wondered, once we get to heaven, Jesus talks sometimes about people, having a great reward in heaven. I wonder who it is that's going to be most famous when we get to heaven. There are some names that are familiar to us that we encounter in Scripture, and I imagine that when I get to heaven one day, I really hope I'll get to meet Abraham and Moses and some of the big names that we all see. But I'd like to believe that there are some places in heaven with special honor for people that we have never heard of before. That some of the people God is most proud of are probably living in towns that we've never been to, doing things that we're never going to know about for people that we've never met. People who are serving humbly because of their faith, not because anyone's going to notice it. And in fact, you could probably walk right past them on the sidewalk and not know there was anything special about that person. But God knows what's going on in the heart. I like to believe that God is really going to honor a lot of people in heaven, that for them and for us will be a great and wonderful surprise, just the way that He makes things right. One of my favorite apostles is Andrew. And when I mention Andrew's name, is there anything that you think of in particular? We talk often about Peter, we can talk about Paul. There's some that do things that are easier to notice. John does some things that's fairly noticeable, but there's not really very much said about Andrew. But I like this about Andrew, that he seems to always be quietly going about doing something good. Andrew was actually Simon Peter's brother. When we first meet Andrew, it's in John chapter 1, and John describes for us the process by which Jesus started gathering his 12, his closest followers. And it says that one day he was going by John the Baptist, and John the Baptist had some of his own disciples with him, the people who were learning from him. And when he saw Jesus going by, he said, "Behold, the Lamb of God." And it said that those two disciples started to follow Jesus, and one of those two men happened to be Andrew. And so they asked Jesus where he was staying, and so he said, "Come and see," and they went with him. But then after they spent the day with him, it says that the very first thing that Andrew did was to go find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah." And he brought him to Jesus, introduced him to Jesus. That's when Peter got the nickname Peter. He used to be Simon, but then Jesus met him when Andrew brought him along, and then he said, "I'm going to call you Cephas or Rock or Rocky or something." He gave him a nickname as soon as he met him. But Andrew's the one who brought Peter to Jesus. So all the stories you have about Peter walking on the water and many of the things he did, had it not been for Andrew, that quiet person willing to bring him along, Peter might not have ever met Jesus. Andrew's the reason that Peter knew Jesus. There's another small but significant part that Andrew plays in the story of the gospel, and it's when Jesus is preaching to a large crowd of people. We know there's at least 5,000 present, and it's a little hard to understand the phrasing, but it seems that there's at least 5,000 men, and who knows how many women and children. So this is an enormous gathering of people, and they're all over there by Galilee, and there's not a lot of food trucks or restaurants around, so the question starts to become, how are we going to feed all these people? And in fact, Jesus even asked that question, John tells us, because he knew what he was going to do and he wanted to test him. So he says, where are we going to get food for all these people? And one pops up and says, well, goodness, half a year's wages. If we spent half a year's wages, we could get all these people one bite of food, but that's not going to do anything. Andrew is the one who spoke up and said, well, I've got a boy here with 5 loaves and 2 fish, and they're not very much among so many, but here they are. He's the one who popped up with those loaves and fish. Just the same, he brought to Jesus what it was that he had to offer. I think we really need more people like Andrew, don't we? Andrew didn't put himself forth as if he were the best teacher or had all knowledge or had all the answers or anything like that, but what he did do was that he thought about the people that he loved, and he did the best that he could to bring them to Jesus. I can't explain everything to you about this guy, but there's something significant. I really wish you would just come along. He brought his brother Peter along. Just come along and see how he is. Listen to him and see if it's true. See if he really is the Messiah. He just humbly kind of brought people along to Jesus. And then there came an opportunity. There was a need. And again, Andrew spoke up and said, I don't have much, but here's something. And Lord, if you want it, you can have it. I'm sure that I can't do everything, but I'll give you what I've got. That humble mentality that quietly says, I'll do what I can. I can at least invite. I can at least give the little that I'm able to give, and I'll stand up and I'll do that every time. I'll invite the people that I can. I'll serve where I can. What a great model for Christian behavior. In the kingdom of heaven, I think people like Andrew are going to be especially valued for the quiet ways that they go about doing good. We have to strive to embrace anonymity in regard to the world. It really doesn't matter if we're famous in the world or not, or if people know who we are or not. What matters is that God is watching us, and God sees our actions, He sees our intentions, and He's going to remember those things. I want to share a few thoughts with us to try and help us work primarily for God's approval. First, I would remind us to remember that every person is in some way my superior. You ever heard that idea before? Every person is in some way my superior. The first time I came across that idea was in the old classic Dale Carnegie book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. This is just kind of a posture for a living, that not that I'm worthless, not that you're worthless, not that everyone in the world's better than me, but what he's saying is every person has within them the image of God. Everyone has gifts that God has given them, where if they were empowered to use those gifts for God, it's something that would be a blessing to others. If I would take the time to get to know people and to pay attention to them and what they value and to celebrate what's good about them, you can find something in every person that I just couldn't offer on my own. There's some way that we complete each other, that each of us on our own wouldn't be quite as whole. It's interesting to me thinking about kids going back to school. I'm sure right now I could talk to a lot of our teachers preparing for this next school year, beginning of the next school year, and I'm sure many of our teachers could share these stories about empowering wisdom, brilliant wisdom that has come from the mouths of children. Have you had those experiences in your life? Have your kids ever suddenly humbled you by the purity of their faith and dedication when you had found a creative way to look the other way and do something else? Children have that way of holding us accountable. I think the same would be true of a lot of our people involved in the prison ministry. Buck, I'm sure you could, and I've heard several stories, but I'm sure you could share stories with us one after another about people who might have a rough history, but because of the love of Christ were transformed and could offer powerful insights into life and living and faith that come from knowing God. If we really take the time to listen to other people and celebrate other people, there's some way that every person is my superior. There's some way that I'm better off for having them around if I would take the time to notice it. And if I'm worried about celebrating other people, maybe I won't get so caught up in trying to make myself be number one or famous. A second thing that we can strive for is to remember to always be storing up our reward in heaven. More than anything else, trying to save up, trying to store up something so that we can be blessed as we enter the final kingdom of heaven. Jesus taught about this in Matthew chapter 6. He says there's so many things that we worry about accumulating. There's all this stuff that you can get. And he said, don't worry about storing up your treasure here, because everything you buy here, if money can buy it, it can be destroyed, it can rot. There's moths, there's bugs, there's mold, there's animals. I mean, you let your house go for a few months and it starts looking rough, doesn't it? I mean, it doesn't take long at all for our possessions just to start crumbling and falling apart and decaying. But he also says, thieves and swindlers can take these things from you. And if all you do is store them up, eventually they're either going to go bad or someone's going to find a way to try and take them from you. But he says, when you're rich toward God, if you're rich toward God, when you store up your treasure in heaven, it doesn't get corrupted, it doesn't rust, it doesn't rot. No one can take it from you because God is the one who has it in his hand, who is going to give it to you. If you're thinking about how to try and store up treasure in heaven, I think one helpful thing would be to have a conversation with someone who knows you well and ask that difficult question, how is it that people think of me? How is it that I normally go about treating other people? Because it's through the love that we show for others that we store up treasure in heaven. So when people think of me, what kind of a presence is it that I have in my family? What kind of a presence is it that I have among my coworkers? Am I a person who creates peace, or am I a person who makes things more difficult? What kind of presence do I have among my friends? Am I known as someone who's compassionate? Am I known as someone who steps up and helps where I can? Or am I someone who just doesn't have time for people? What about the people at my church? Can people depend on me for things? Do they know the areas that I would gladly step up and help? Or do I manage to always just stay under the radar? Am I storing up treasures in heaven? As someone who knows me well, do you see me actively doing these things? And what are the areas that are my blind spots? So there should be some things about us that are conspicuous, but it's also important that each of us is involved in doing things that no one else knows about. Some of the things that God is going to proclaim openly in heaven are the things that are done in secret on earth. Now, if you're doing bad things in secret, that's a scary thought. But if you're a person who goes about doing good that no one ever knows about, these are the things Christ tells us that God can't wait to proclaim loudly for everyone to know about so that he can honor them and acknowledge them. It's important that we're all involved in good things that people know, but I would challenge you to have at least something in your life you're actively involved with that is a good thing that no one else knows about. Something that really is just you and God, and sometimes maybe occasionally one other person. I have to say, this has been for me one of the joys of ministry, is because by nature of my role here, a lot of times I'm able to find out about some of these things that no one else knows. I can remember in particular one conversation I had with a person at the last church where I was working, and this person was actually coming to me to criticize this other individual at the church, and how they're uninvolved or whatever they were saying about them. And I just had to kind of bite my tongue because I thought, if you only knew the things they were doing, you just want to slap yourself right now. But it's good to be a person who has something going on in your life that's a good thing, that's just between you and God. You're doing it for God, that you can't possibly get traced back to you, that no one else is going to find out about. Whatever it is you're doing, it's important that we remember to store up treasures in heaven, because those are the kind that will last. And thirdly, we had our reading from Hebrews chapter 12. It's important to remember the cloud of witnesses, to use the terminology here in the book of Hebrews. This concept really gets started around Hebrews chapter 11, where we do this walk through all the heroes of faith. And then he gets to chapter 12 in the passage we had read for us by James this morning about the way that there's this great cloud of witnesses. There's all these people who've been faithful to God and have finished that race. And it's like they're now waiting for us. I don't know how long the world will endure, but one of my personal goals is that whenever I'm gone, at some point, I know I'm going to be forgotten, right? Generations are going to move on. No one's going to be talking about me 200 years from now. But I love to think that whenever they read that Hebrews 12 verse about the cloud of witnesses, I like to think I'll get to be part of that cloud, that somehow the faith got passed on, and even if they don't know what I did, at least I did my part in keeping that chain as strong as I could. Wouldn't you like that for yourself, to know part of that great cloud of witnesses? Hebrews chapter 12 verses 1 and 2 are the verses we normally read about that, but this idea actually continues further down in the passage. I want to read this passage for you. I'm actually going to read it through twice. I want you to really think about the cloud of witnesses, the people who finished before you. I like to imagine that they're now cheering for you, urging you to finish strong. I want you to really let this vision soak in about who it is that's waiting for us, who it is that wants to see us succeed. If you could pull back the curtains on heaven right now and see what's going on, maybe this is what you would see. He says, "But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." Abel, that person who was killed innocently, had done nothing wrong. And Genesis talks about the blood of Abel crying out innocently from the ground. He says, a voice even better than the blood of Abel can speak. Again, I want you to listen to this one more time. And in your head, I want you to try and populate this place and see some faces. You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly, to the church of the firstborn whose names are written in heaven. You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. I wonder in your head, as you start populating that great crowd, who are some of the faces that you're seeing there? I imagine there are probably some familiar faces. Moses, Abraham, Elijah, David. Maybe you picture people like Ruth and Esther, or Deborah, or Tabitha. And I like to picture them with their hands cupped around their mouth as they're cheering, saying, "You can finish it. Don't give up. It's worth it. It's worth it. Stick with it." I like to imagine them cheering for us, but I bet in your life you probably have some other people who have now joined that cloud of witnesses. Sometimes in church we sing that song that heaven holds all to me. And I think the older we get, the more people that we've lost in the faith, whether it be a parent or a grandparent or a spouse or just someone who was a great teacher or a mentor in your life, they go on to heaven. And I like to picture that they're still there cheering, encouraging, wanting to see us finish strong, wanting to welcome us at the finish line. Perhaps some of the best instruction we could find for running this race well is found in Psalm 90. Psalm 90 in verse 12 says, "Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom." Teach us to number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom. If you want to live as a wise person, you'll go ahead and recognize that you don't have an endless amount of time, that you don't have an endless amount of life or energy, and at some point your days are going to run out, and you really don't know when that. We have some control over that through our lifestyles and what we do, but there's always a bunch of unknown factors that can change that very rapidly and without any kind of warning. We know our days are numbered. We don't know exactly how many we have, but when we realize this, hopefully it helps us to be wise in our hearts, that we see that it's only God's approval in the end that's going to matter, and that we strive for the things that would make God proud so that when God sees us, He's rejoicing over the way that we lived. And even if we're famous to the world, if God doesn't know us, if we've not become rich in heaven, then we've really made a lot of poor decisions in what we've done. A wise heart learns to love what matters most, and it's certainly not being famous. As you think about your own life today, maybe there's some ways you've been trying too hard to hang on to your ego or your need to be seen a certain way. And this idea of embracing anonymity, maybe there's some ways you really need to push yourself just to start doing good for the sake of doing good and to stop trying to get credit for everything. Maybe there's some significant changes that you need to make. Maybe you need to commit your life to Christ this morning so that you can join that number one day as part of that cloud of witnesses ready to cheer on the next generation, the next ones who carry that torch of faith. Whatever your needs are this morning, this is a time you can respond, and we'd invite you to come forward as together we stand and sing.